The following is an excerpt from a conversation with the warrior philosopher.
Societies start to decay when their rituals, their values, and their institutions are no longer connected with life and with the basic functions of life. So, in the past, we'd have rituals like animal sacrifice, which is a religious ritual which is making holy the process of butchering and eating an animal. Today, we just have factory farming. We don't think about it. The food just shows up in a store. And so we're disconnected from our food. But the same applies to other things like music, like art. These things would have served functions. Myths had meaning. They had practical meaning to them. They weren't just these abstract stories. They had meaning which was connected to life. For example, the myth of Persephone, of course, is intimately connected with the seasons, with death, with rebirth, with agriculture, with the Eleusinian mysteries. So you get at the end of the hymn to Demeter, you get an explanation of the Eleusinian mysteries, just a brief one, because it was of course secretive, but you get a nod towards these mysteries. So the whole hymn to Demeter, this myth about death, about marriage, about reproduction, agriculture, is then tied to this religious festival, this religious ritual. So everything was tied to the essential drives, the essential instincts, the necessary practices of life, like marriage, the necessary virtues like courage in war. And when we get to this, I guess you could say, decadent stage in society, we see that everything becomes disconnected from life. And I guess modern art would be a great example, where it's just these shapes which don't mean anything. They don't have a connection to anything. And that's almost the purpose, is to make it as disconnected and disconcerting and alienating as possible.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned the aspect of ritual, because what is ritual but not trying to invoke a certain quality onto its listener or the witness of the ritual? I think a lot of early music is absolutely a recounting of either founding myths or religion itself. And I think the reason for this and why music begins this way is because, obviously, with myth, what is the point of myth? Well, the point of myth is supposed to get you to act a certain way, aspire to be something. So we look at the founding myths of any successful peoples. It's always to invoke this heroic quality by showing you the heroes of the past and by saying you should be like them. So, of course, you have the heroes such as Hercules, you have Perseus, you have, with the Iliad, you have obviously Homer recounting the great feats of Achilles, or even anyone else within that story. You have the Aeneid, obviously, recounting the early history of Rome, and the early history of Rome is filled with these great heroes. It's filled with Aeneas himself, Romulus and Remus, and then, of course, throughout Roman history, you immortalize all the great people who moved Rome forward, who moved Rome towards higher power. So early music, in a lot of ways, is just an extension of this mythos, because obviously, especially when things were passed down orally, like, people don't realize how difficult it must have been to recount the Iliad for hundreds of years before it was actually written down. That's why it was in this rhythmic, poetic structure. And of course, the Ark once recounted, or not recounted, but once gave us the privilege of listening to the first stanza of the Iliad, because you speak a little bit of ancient Greek, and that was really cool. And that demonstrates, well, there's this almost musical quality to how they presented it. And I think a lot of early music begins as this almost ritualistic thing, this recounting of heroism, this recounting of an ideal that you want the listener or the witness of this ritual or this song to emulate. So then when we look at modern art, it's interesting because, well, what are we trying to emulate anymore? If in the case of Taylor Swift, she sings about getting broken up with all the time, very petty heartbreak that really doesn't have a lot of substance to it. So what are you passing on to women, for example, through Taylor Swift's music? It's you're gonna get broken up with. You're gonna get your heart broken by a man. You're going to be distrustful of men. That's essentially what she's passing on. Be distrustful of men. If you look at all these sad songs today, obviously there was a video that I think both of us watched by Uber Boyo, where he's talking about the sort of sad, depressing, weak, modern sort of, I don't even know what to call it, but just the sad music like you get with Radiohead, for example, which is the example he used. And he's talking about how sad my life is. It's so depressing. I can't do anything. I have no agency. I'm just this sad little thing. So, of course, what does that impart to the listener? It imparts you're this sad little thing with no agency. You have no control of your destiny. Relish and wallow in this sadness. So that's what you're passing on to people. And even with something like rap, which is a little bit more vitalistic, because instead of being sad, it's like, oh, I'm gonna have sex with hoes and make money and run up on the ops. It's also like, well, what does this really contribute culturally? We're gonna have a bunch of barbaric thugs, which doesn't really build anything. It's like you're still sort of in touch with that original violent energy, but there's no structure to it. It's too Dionysian in a way. There is no structure to, well, how do we use this violence? Whereas the songs of the past, it gives you this framework under which you can operate. It's the framework of, here is a heroic mythos where there is a specific goal, and where these people are fulfilling a specific goal through the heroic ideal, which ends up being beneficial for the collective group which that hero represents. For Achilles, though he has selfish moments, ultimately he is who delivers, not quite he himself, but he contributes to delivering the Greeks' victory. Or Odysseus, for example, with his horse, the Trojan horse. That's the story you tell, is his heroism contributes to the collective effort of the Greeks. So today you don't really have that. You don't have any structure to even the vitalist energy. So where do you go from there? So I think that's really pertinent that you bring that up. And I think when we talk about cultural renaissance, we have to think, well, how do we reinvoke the vitalism of the past that does lead people to heroism?
I guess to go back to myth and ritual, in a sense, rituals have a utilitarian purpose, right? Like animal sacrifice ritualizes, again, butchering animals. You might have a marriage ritual, and these are all rituals which are built around the essential needs of life, reproduction, eating. But the point of the myth and the point of the ritual is to contextualize them. So we're not, it tells us why we're doing this thing. So with animal sacrifice, it's related to the myth of Prometheus. So it's not just that we're sacrificing an animal and, we're going to say, yes, thank you, nature, for providing us with sustenance, or something kind of superficial like this. It's connected to this whole theology, this whole worldview. And again, same thing with marriage, or the Dionysian mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries. They're all connected with a greater worldview and within a greater context. And I think nihilism, to a large extent, is lacking that context, feeling like you are out of context, like you're not connected to any greater tradition. And so, as you say, creating that tradition, or recreating that tradition, or even reconnecting with that tradition, because I think it doesn't always have to be a new tradition. A lot of the times, the act of founding can be an almost fabricated history, like with Geoffrey of Monmouth saying that Brutus founded Britain, right? Brutus, the grandson, I believe, of Aeneas. So whether that history is fabricated, or it's an invented myth, or whether it's a real event, what's really important is that it gives context to the individual, so that when they're acting, when they're maybe even doing simple things like eating, or when they're just going throughout their daily life, they feel that their action has meaning because it's connected to this broader context, it's connected to this greater worldview. And let me actually pull up a little passage from Nietzsche here, Twilight of the Idols, which I have on hand, where he's talking about the meaning of the Dionysian mysteries. And he, of course, talks about, the things which he always talks about, the will to life, the expression of excessive energy, the making wholly of pain in relation to creation, that, in pregnancy you need pain, so you need pain to create life and so on. But towards the end of the passage, he says this interesting thing. He says, quote, "What did the Hellene gain for himself with these mysteries?" And, referring to the Dionysian mysteries. And I continue the quote, "Eternal life, the eternal recurrence of life, the future promised and hallowed in the past, the triumphant yea to life despite death and change, real life conceived as the collective prolongation of life through procreation, through the mysteries of sexuality," end quote. So I think what's really important there is he's pointing to the idea of life not as just the life of the individual, but as a prolonged force, or something like this. So through procreation, life is reborn each generation. So it's actually a generational project. And in the Dionysian mysteries, you would connect to this kind of greater life force, right, which is expressed in you, but is also part of this great chain. It is also reborn each season, like Persephone, and that really puts you in a greater context. And today, when we think of nihilism, like typical nihilistic views that a teenager might have, like, what's the point? We all die anyway, and so on. This conception of life as an intergenerational project actually addresses most of those concerns, because then your life is no longer just your individual life in isolation, and what you do actually matters because it connects to this broader tradition, and it actually, affects life itself.
For access to exclusive, long-form content and the ARC's private Telegram community, check the links in the description.